Alright, Chapter 1, Permit Required Confined Space Overview. So in this chapter, we're going to define what a permit or confined space is, what a confined space is, differentiate between the confined space and a permit required confined space, and I'm not going to say PRCS. I don't know, maybe I will, but I'll have it written out for you. Analyze the characteristics of what the permit required confined space is, and then also we're going to state the elements in the regulation for general industry, construction, and maritime. So hopefully with this differentiation and the one when I do the definitions, it's really going to help you kind of get a good understanding of which standard is which for construction, maritime, and general industry. So here's your basic definition of a confined space. You can get into the space, it's large enough for you to get in there. You have to do some work, right? So you have to get in that space. So that's definition number one. Number two, it's limited or restricted means of entry and exit. You may hear the words access and egress. Same thing, in and out. It's just a limited way of getting in and out of that space. And then number three, the space itself is not designed for continuous human occupancy. You can't set up your office in there and just hang out. That's not what this space was meant for. So you put those three things together, now you have a confined space. So limited access. Here's some examples of what limited access means. So access to open top spaces may require the use of ladders, hoists, other devices. And that's, if you're going open, going down, or you're going laterally, any of those things where it's the condition could be really hard for a rescue to be attempted because you have different ways and harder ways to get in and out of that space. So that's your example of the limited access. So when do you need a permit? Well, now when that space has some additional characteristics that will create a hazard, now you need the permit. So once there's a hazard that exists, you're going to have to get that permit, and the system of permit required confined space entry will start being initiated because you want to protect the person in there, the entrant, from being exposed to that hazard. So that's when you have to get into that. So there's different hazards. You could have internal hazards, configuration hazards. You could have anything that is going to eventually make it hard for someone to get out or to be rescued, or the condition is in such way that it could cause a serious health or safety hazard to that individual. So that's now when you need that permit. So you're looking at these pictures over here. There's 4 different types of confined spaces in this picture. There's more, but just showing you 4 here. You could even call it attic and a crawl space a confined space. OSHA does say that in one of the letters interpretation. However, they said because of the natural ventilation, absence of any other hazard, then it could just be a confined space and entry would not require a permit. But it just really depends. The person who is making that decision to say this is confined space but not a permit required confined space must be competent enough to understand the difference and the hazards. So I'm going to give you some characteristics of what a confined space would look like. Internal configuration. If it's open, no obstructions, no barriers, anything else in that way in that space. If it is obstructed, now you got something that's in the way that you got to maneuver around, get over, get under. Any of those, that is now additional hazard. Elevation, the entrance portal or opening is above grade by 4 feet or more. Now that elevation itself will become an actual barrier to entry. That now becomes a configuration hazard due to elevation. Non-elevation, entrance of the portal located less than 4 feet above the ground. The portal size itself becomes restricted when it's at 24 inches or less in its dimensions, and unrestricted if it's bigger. But though you may have an unrestricted portal size, it may still be considered a permit required confined space or a confined space because of the other two definitions. So you still got to remember that. The space access could be horizontal, could be vertical. It really just depends on what the entry is. So let's talk to you a little bit about the differences in the setup of the standards. So what you're looking at is 1910, which is general industry, subpart J, and then it is 146. So the number after the dot is going to be section 1910, section 146. You have your scope and application, definitions, your requirements, the permit required space itself. They'll explain a little bit about that in that standard. The permit system, the entry permit, the training requirements, duties of the authorized attendants, the entrance, the supervisor, rescue and services, and then the participation of the employees. There's even appendices in the back. One is giving you a flow chart so you could decide, is this a permit required confined space? So you kind of go down the list and you go through the flow chart, and then you'll be able to, check everything off. It'll also give you procedures for atmospheric testing, and then examples of what a confined space entry permit program should look like, and then a checklist. And if you're doing any sewer system entry, there's an appendix just for you that's specific for doing that type of entry. And then there's a rescue team or rescue service evaluation criteria in appendix F. 1926 subpart AA is construction. In the construction subpart, scope, definitions, general requirements, the program, entry process, entry permit, training, the duties of the entrance attendant and the entry supervisor, the rescue and the service, employee participation, provisions of documents for the secretary or to the secretary, so basically the secretary of labor, or their designee, which is basically the OSHA compliance officer. Then there's provisions for them to get that documentation. So in the maritime, 1915 subpart B has the scope, application, definition first, precautions of ordering of testing before entering confined in enclosed spaces and other dangerous atmospheres, cleaning and other cold work, hot work, maintenance of safe conditions, warning signs and labels. Then they do have appendix for compliance guidelines in those enclosed spaces and dangerous atmospheres. Then again, there's another appendix there, which is an actual reprint of the U.S. Coast Guard regulations referenced in subpart B for the determination of Coast Guard authorized persons. So when that jurisdiction switches over from OSHA to Coast Guard, then there is some information in there in maritime. So in this chapter, you learned a little bit about the confined space, large enough to get a person into space. It has limited or restricted, that's the key words, limited or restricted means of access and egress, not designated for continuous employee occupancy. A permit is needed if the space or the enclosure has a hazard. A permit is definitely one of those things that you're going to need if you find a hazard. So definitely stick that bullet number 2 in your head. A hazard is anything that could injure or harm an individual, and there's many types of characteristics of a space that makes it a confined space. So that was the chapter summary. Next chapter we'll go over definitions and we'll go over our duties.